Fintech Chatter TV. Presented by Tier 1 People. Leaders in Fintech Executive Search.
Leda, welcome to Fintech Chatter.
So good to be here. So good to be back.
Yeah. So, was it 2018 when you were last here for Sibos?
Yeah.
Wow.
A long time ago.
And friends reunited, eh? 2.5 years since we last caught up.
Too bloody long. Yeah. Too bloody long.
Well, it's bloody great to have you back in Oz, and fantastic to be talking to you about 10x as well. Probably, to my mind, I think the most significant fintechy thing that happened in Australia.
Hear that?
Yeah, pioneering, the first Big Four bank to go majorly into open banking. The first Big Four bank, or big bank anywhere in the world, to partner with a major fintech in Afterpay. And really want to have a chat with you today about all things 10x and a little bit about, your plans here in Australia as well.
That's great.
So before we kind of go into that, you might maybe sharing with us a little bit about yourself and who you are and kind of how you got to be at 10x.
Yes, of course. Well, I think it's fair to say I'm a recovering banker. I've spent a very long time.
A bankaholic.
A bankaholic. I'm a banker in recovery. Hasn't quite happened yet. I spent a long time inside traditional banks before fintech was a thing. But I was, with hindsight, lucky to do the things that put me in the right place. So I worked on business transformation, business process reengineering, process automation, revenue protection. So all of those solve the problem using people, process, and technology, and sort of efficiency design. So between operations and client management. So when fintech started becoming a thing in banking, those of us who were sitting in that space were the only people who could be brought in to poke this new thing and see if it's real or if it's useful. So I was lucky enough to sit in a big bank at the time when it all began. And when did it all begin? I tend to start the clock around 2005, but it's round about then.
Yeah.
And it's been, so I spent a very long time on the bank side and then crossed over to the fintech side about 5 years ago now. I work in the core banking space, but I actually do think that in order to change one thing, you need to get the whole thing, because everything is connected. Everything is an ecosystem, not in the fluffy way of everyone is a friend, but everything plugs into everything else. So you need to understand how it works. So currently, I've been with 10x coming up to 2 years now. So I started in the middle of lockdown. And it's a very interesting experience onboarding with any company in the middle of lockdown. You don't know how tall anyone is. and it's all very mediated. And it takes a lot of effort for a company to make you feel like you've come home in such a strange place. But 10x is solving a very particular problem in a very particular way. And the geek in me rejoices in that. And we have some amazing clients.
Yeah.
As you say, work with Westpac here and doing some very, very interesting work. So
there's a lot of banking as a service players out there. You talk about some of your clients. I think there's quite a few outstanding, or what makes 10x a little bit more outstanding to the competitors. I mean, first of all, your CEO and founder, significant in the banking space.
He's a big deal.
Yeah.
He doesn't act like he's a big deal. I've never seen humility like Anthony has in someone of that pedigree. But there is no ego there in a way that is almost hard to believe after all the time we've both spent in this industry, right? Between founders and CEOs of big banks, you don't expect to find someone who's that accessible. It's an interesting fact, actually, that among our senior leadership, if you ask people why you joined, people say, we have an incredible product, incredible opportunity in the market, given our partners, our investors, our clients. It's a powerful story. We chose to go right at the top of the complexity scale and solve the hardest problem first, and then you can do the easy stuff afterwards. But everyone will also say, and Anthony. So Anthony Jenkins is our founder, our CEO. He's a very unusual animal in this industry. And he's a great guy to work for. I went between for and with, because although he's the CEO, he doesn't make you feel like you work for him. It is a very, very work with. But I had a recruiter call me not so long ago. If Anthony's listening to this, I didn't take the job, boss. But it was they needed a Greek-speaking digital banking specialist for Greece. And it was very much a write your own paycheck. And I was like, oh, I don't know. Part of me is curious to hear more, but actually I really love my job and I really like my boss. And the recruiter said, I have nothing. If you like your boss, I have nothing. And it's true. It's true.
It's great though, because I think that's one of the challenges, right? Is we've talked about this a lot, the difficulties that people have moving from a big banking environment into a startup kind of scale-up environment. It's really difficult, very, very different set of behaviors. You are right. It's very difficult. And one of the things I have found interesting and challenging over the years, and you and I have talked about this a lot over the years, is that most people think of themselves as someone who can make that transition. Everybody does, right?
So when you're interviewing someone who wants to make the transition, they're not lying to you about how sure they are they can do it. Sometimes they're lying to themselves. And it's not easy to know who will make the jump and land. Sometimes you have a good instinct, but I have seen more than once people who really believe they can make the transition. And then they do, and they just cannot. Working for a startup is a very, very different animal. Even for a company like us, absolute scale up, well-funded with real live instances running. We're not a project. We're not an early stage startup. We have some heavy hitting clients operating in multiple geographies, fantastic senior team, fantastic backers. It's still a scale up. It doesn't have the places to hide, the guardrails, you still need to roll your sleeves up in a way that is different to a big company. I still see a lot of people who so believe they can do it. And it's hard to see them not, but the ones that do, it's such a nice thing to see the transition, to see the ability to translate what you learned as a banker when you go into recovery. Yeah,
you talked there about the interview process, and I think that's the biggest challenge, right? Is that people do tell each other, and this is on both sides, right? Tell each other what they want to hear, and I've often found that it's the questions that are asked in an interview. Or the way in which the process works, which just isn't set to actually be able to test, whether somebody has those things. Because if every single person I've asked, are you up for a challenge? Everybody says yes.
Of course they do. Yeah. Are you a self-starter? Can you work without a big team around you? Of course I can. But...
Yeah, and I think the kind of issue comes at when you're working relentlessly that way, when there's nowhere to hide, when you make mistakes. And let's face it, right? A banking environment or any large corporate, you get rewarded for hiding mistakes or blaming someone else.
The closet of shame. The closet of shame. Right? Absolutely.
Whereas in a startup or a scale-up environment, that's kind of the fastest way for you to lose your job. Yeah. Right? Because it destroys the culture. Not making the mistake. Yeah. Hiding the mistake 100%. Or blaming someone else. 100%. Making the mistake, it's as long as you own it.
We all make mistakes.
And I think this is the kind of issue is how do you create an environment in an interview where, let's face it, it's a charade, right? We're taught to tell each other what we want to hear. We're taught that we're going to be asked these questions. How do you actually then be able to cut through that and see those qualities in somebody that you feel, hey, maybe they've got the potential that they're going to make this happen?
I wish I could tell you I have a formula. I don't. In that, we have certain things that we will do in interviews. I wouldn't say it's foolproof.
Yeah.
I don't ask any of these standard questions because they have standard answers. I find that asking some slightly unexpected questions gives you an interesting insight in the person. My favorite is, what have you learned recently? I find it fascinating what people tell me. And it's very rare a work-related thing, and I love that.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you some things that work well for me. One is that I always, no matter what the role is, have a very big chunk of the team interview. Because at the end of the day, they're going to live with this person. Yeah. So it's always a collective decision. not because we're incapable of making decisions, but because it has to be a collective decision. Because if that person doesn't perform, it impacts all of us. And if that person has to be supported, moved, or exited, it has to also be a collective decision, because as a unit, we need to work together, right? So it creates a test in chemistry as well. Would you like this? Because this is what it would feel like. And also, do we feel like we can make space for you? So I'm a big believer in that collective ownership of the process. Fundamentally, it's my fault if we get it wrong. But it has to be a collective decision to get it right. So I would say I always default in that. Depending on the role, there might be some technical components, there might not. But there's something about attitude. There's something about that chemistry of the person who goes, I'm raring to go. You can't fake that. The other thing you can't fake is depth. I see a lot of people coming into interviews trying to impress me. You cannot, boys and girls, you can't fake depth. I would much rather have someone say, I've been doing this for 5 years. I find it very interesting. This is what I know. This is what I'm interested in. Than trying to create an impression of, I know everything.
So I always wanted to ask you this, right? How many times have you had an interview where you thought, they've just listened to a podcast that I've been on recently and further repeated everything?
Quite a few. I've had quite a few of those. I've had quite a few who've done their research. So they will sort of drop references about where I've worked or 10x facts. And it's like, okay, that's a little stalkerish. Like, I'm glad you did your research, but you knowing where I did my postgraduate degree doesn't make me feel like you're good at this job. It makes me feel like I need to go and like check that my address is off registry. Faking depth is a red flag, obviously. I have Sam Moore, if you're listening to this was good advice. Sam told me about 15 years ago that when he was a submariner, the most important thing they did was push people to get to the place where they say, I don't know. Because the most dangerous thing you can do on a submarine is fake it. Because people could die. Now, in our situations, people couldn't die. But I really value people go, I don't know about that. Or I hadn't thought of that. I really value that. So it's creating these casual conversations that allow you to see a little bit of what a person is about. Not too struck. Because people, to your point, people know the script. They will give you the right answer. But if you create a situation where someone goes, well, I didn't know that. That means a lot to me.
And I've used this analogy for, I think, the last 10 years now. If you imagine going on a date and it was like an interview, you wouldn't do the second date, right? Like somebody's there with a clipboard of questions saying, hey, Leda, can you tell me about a time when you've broken up with someone? How did you respond when you found out someone was cheating on you? How much do you earn? Can I have the names and numbers of 2 of your exes? And by the way, if I'm interested, I'll call you back and we'll do this again. I'll bring a friend along.
A friend of mine had someone do that on a date.
Really?
He took notes.
Wow. That is awesome.
There was no second date.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a second date, right?
No second date.
But the whole interview process is that, and then that again, and then deciding whether you move in with each other or not. And it's kind of crazy, right?
It's insane. When you put it like that.
So I love the thing of just creating this environment where, that, and being pushed to say, I don't know, because it is something I think is critically important in in any business, but particularly in a startup.
Agree. The other thing I find very important, and I do it a lot in interviews, is I always ask, what are you after? But also, what needs to be true for you to succeed? Because we're all a bit different.
Yeah.
And it takes a certain degree. In a startup, you need to have enough self-awareness to manage yourself a very large percent of the time, because everyone is going at full tilt, right? So I find that the minute I start getting a formulaic answer to what needs to be true for you to succeed, I need a supportive manager. Like all of those things that are true, but don't actually tell me that you have self-awareness about the way you work. It is always a little bit of a red flag.
A little tip that I kind of learned about 10 years ago, which I think was, certainly it's every approach that I've got now whenever I speak with anyone, because I don't do interviews. We just have conversations about the opportunity. But the first question that I ask is, what questions do you have for me?
Always. And it tells me so much.
It tells you way more than any other question that I ask someone.
And sometimes it's I'll confess that at times in my career in the past, I led with that because I hadn't had time to prepare for the interview. Like, I haven't even read your CV. Let me actually start with that. But I have found that it's actually the most valuable way to start because it tells you a lot about the person, the types of questions they ask. And I also am a big believer that there's absolutely nothing wrong about asking about money.
Yeah.
I find it very weird when people are weird about money in a job interview.
I have this conversation with everyone, and I mean everyone, right? And when it comes to money, everybody will tell me the same thing, right? Money is not important.
Bollocks.
Exactly, right? And that's my response. And then, to back that up, say, hey, yeah, sure. But here's a bit of data, right? For every search that I do, the successful candidate, I invest about 10 hours in negotiation of salary, right? Yeah. And that's not because people are being dicks. It's just because there's a lot of complexity to get people comfortable where everybody feels, hey, yeah, we can now move forward.
I don't buy money's not important. Right? And if somebody tells me that in an interview, I'm like, you're doing this wrong.
Yeah. And this is the thing. It absolutely should be important. It's really important, right?
It is absolutely.
And I think it is
important that you should expect me to reward you fairly.
Yeah, and the stigma that's attached to it, I think, is people feel somehow that they're being greedy by asking for what they want, and it's or putting this number in a flag in the sand.
Look, you might ask for something and not get it.
So I've heard people pull up numbers and they've been delusional.
Yes. So I interviewed someone I really liked a couple of years back. Really liked her. And then I let our HR discuss, what's your current package? Because of course you need to make sure that there is parity, but it won't be like for like. Yeah. And she absolutely refused to tell us what her package was. And I spoke to our HR and HR was like, well, she's refusing. What do you want me to do? And I was like, I'll talk to her. So I picked up the phone and I said, look, refusing to tell us what your package is a way of doing this, but it's a little clumsy because we're trying to actually make this appealing for you. Yeah. So it's not an unusual question, but have you ever negotiated a salary before? She goes, no. And I said, okay. Women tend not to, so I'm glad that you're trying to. Frankly, I am glad because women tend to accept what they're given. So I was really glad to see a young woman. But I said that she had given a number to our HR. And I said, I think the number you've given our HR is 4 times what you make now, roughly. And she goes, how did you know that? I said, because I wasn't born yesterday. Yeah. So clumsy. And now do you want to bring it back or do you burn a bridge? I love seeing people negotiate. I think it's the right thing. I love seeing women negotiate. We don't have enough of that. But in that negotiation, you need to have a sense of what you're worth, what the market is doing, because there's always that. And also the fact that the person who's negotiating with you was not born yesterday. Yeah. They didn't come out of a cave. So there is a reasonable place that you need to get to. And you need to get to that without too much of a fight because you want to know that your employer will turn around and say, well done, I appreciate you. Here's a pay rise without you having to fight.
Yeah, I've got a kind of an analogy of, risk-based pricing model. And particularly for startups, right? The more risk that you take on, right, you're not going to get you're going to get a lower premium but a higher reward. And I think the less risk that you take on, you might get a bigger base salary, but you're not going to get as big a reward. You might not get any reward. But I think that the biggest issue that we see, and we highly supportive of. And I think our numbers kind of back it up of 42% of the hires that we made are females in leadership positions, right?
But that's how you and I met.
Yeah, it is. That's how we met.
You were looking for female candidates for an area that, and you came out to the industry and said, who don't I know? I love that.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge that you've talked about there is exactly what we see as well.
Yes, it is a fact that I have in my time seen a lot of women in leadership positions who will negotiate hard on behalf of their company, but not necessarily always for themselves. Yeah. So when I do see a female candidate negotiating, I love it. Yeah. And actually, I had a guy in an interview recently saying, is it okay to ask about remuneration? It's mandatory. You need to know. And actually, I find it very strange. Personally, how late we leave it. Yeah. in the process. But
that example that you gave, actually, somebody pointed me to some research, and it was back in the HBR, and it was exactly on this point. And it was, that it's not that women don't negotiate, but I think it was the stats for it being perceived negatively were way higher than if guys did. And one of the elements of that article, and one of the kind of fixes that they, turnarounds that they'd mentioned was exactly what you talked about, is how do you kind of position yourself as a value proposition where everybody wins? Now an example where you're asking for 4 times your salary, I'm uncertain to see, hey, well, how does everybody win, right? And it's even the person getting the job, they're putting themselves in a losing position.
Yeah.
Because the expectation is, hey, you're going to deliver a lot more, right?
But I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, that particularly when you're hiring for a startup, you're looking for a certain degree of self-awareness. And also, you can't fake depth.
Yeah.
So what does that communicate to me as a hiring manager? That there's a naivety there, and that the awareness of the market isn't what is needed for the role. But that doesn't mean that this person won't get it. So I hope that at some point I see her name appear in an application again before long. And I'm not saying that all hiring processes are created equal, right? But I do feel that what I want to see when a candidate comes into the room to meet me is a conversation of equals. We're both shopping.
Yeah.
We're both choosing. We're both buying.
Yeah.
I need to pitch myself and my company and my team to them as much, no less, no more, as they need to pitch it to me.
Yeah.
And that's something that at 10X we feel super strongly, that you go into a candidate conversation, they need to persuade you that they will come into your precious team and be an additive factor from a culture perspective and an effort perspective. But you also need to persuade them that you're a good place to spend the majority of their waking hours. And knowing that when you talk to a candidate, you're pitching them as much as they're pitching you is a cultural thing, but one that is so important.
Yeah. And what a beautiful segue into the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about.
You'd think we scripted this.
It almost is beautifully scripted, because the common denominator of every single person, I think that, I've got a job for, and a lot of people in my network, my clients, if you would ask them, the thing that is more important than money, right? Because it is, but what's more important than that? Everyone, they're united by this one thing, and it's to build a legacy with people that they want to be around. Which kind of leads me nicely onto the work of 10X, because the work that you're doing is some of the most cutting edge with substance work that's happening in the whole of fintech globally, and it's happening here in Australia right now.
It is. It's exciting. So I'm very passionate about the work we do at 10X. So 10X is called 10X because Anthony, our leader, founded the company because he fundamentally believed the banks could do better for communities, society, and the economy. And not a little better, but 10X better.
Yeah.
And actually, branding is a funny thing, but we live that brand. So when you have a conversation inside the company, it's like, is it 10X better? And it's not tongue in cheek. It's like a little better does not differentiate you. Is it 10X better? Now, how do you measure that? That becomes a bigger conversation. But fundamentally, the vision of the business is technology has held us back at the institutional level for so long. And you and I have been with this fintech wave for such a long time. And for such a long time was a lot of user experience on the edges, things that you could do, accepting that the infrastructure was ancient and rickety and couldn't support really fundamental vision. And 10X is in that small bucket of players that goes, change the infrastructure, don't limit the dream. Now, 10X is unique in that it has decided really actively to go at the top of the complexity scale and say, if I can create a capability that is fully cloud native, fully flexible, fully scalable, I was going to say fully secure, but I don't want to tempt the fate, but as secure as can be and constantly challenging itself to be more of all of those things, for the most complicated, most demanding financial services providers, then doing it for the less complicated is easier, rather than starting with something simple and working our way up. Now, that's not an easy thing to decide to do. And I think the experience and exposure of our founder made that possible, right?
Yeah.
But today, 6 years on, we're live in the UK with Chase. We're live
They've
here.
got some massive numbers.
They've got some massive numbers. They're scaling crazy, which is fantastic to see. Fantastic to see. And we're here with Westpac, live with a really innovative business model. Because as you say, there are a lot of banking as a service players out there, but a real big, sizable, institutional, respected bank going, I'll do this. They're the first.
Yeah.
And they're the first who are really putting that vision to work and really putting their money where their mouth is, because they've launched the banking as a service platform with a really fresh vision of bringing the partners on board and creating a genuine ecosystem, not kumbaya, but actual capability layering. And at the same time, we announced not so long ago that we'll be working with the institutional bank because they really believe that, the cloud is not a newfangled crazy thing. It's how you get scale for really serving your clients. I gave a keynote not so long ago about how embedded finance and open banking has been maturing for the last 10 years. Capabilities, technology, data models, regulatory environments, and sort of where all those things meet. But the real thing that brings them all together, actually there's two of them. One is understanding the economics of how these platforms work. The second is leadership. Is the group of people who go, we're doing it. Yeah.
Now that's, I think, been the biggest bugbear for the fintech industry here in Oz. Certainly, I'd say, for the first kind of 5-6 years, the last 12 months, I think it's got a lot better. We're seeing all of the major big four banks now playing in the space in some way. What is it that you think has kind of, because when you were in here in 2018, it was a very different story. In fact, for me, it was probably one of my breakthrough moments was Sibos happening here in 2018. And I remember going home to my wife, Joanne, and saying, I think I've backed the right horse with the business and going for it. But it was a long road. It was 3 years to get to that point where kind of I truly believed that, hey, this is now really going to be a thing here in Australia. What do you think has changed in the time that you've, since you've been last year?
So I think everything has changed, but not because something has radically changed, but rather because things have been maturing. So it feels very different. But I don't think it's because there's been a gear change, but rather some of the things that were beginning to be true at the time have had time to mature and gestate. I think one of the biggest things is the regulator. I am a big believer that what is possible in terms of business model, economic exchange, economic model is really driven in each jurisdiction by the guardrails and parameters the regulatory regime creates. And I have found that the regulators in Australia have been visionary and actually pioneering and charting a path that a lot of others are following. Open banking is a good example. And there are others, they're not the only ones, but they are leading with it. So I do think that one of the things that is definitely feeling different is that the regulatory components have had time to gestate, take root, and you see the creativity in the new space, because a lot of this was fairly new last time we were physically here. The other is you're getting talent that's now done it once before. Even though there have been some amazing stories never told here in Australia. Some businesses that started, like, this is like, that's everywhere, by the way. It's not just here. But because it is a smaller and slightly more remote market, and we've had 2 years of no immigration, I'm guessing, right? The fact that your local talent pool has the scars now is super important. Even though it's painful on an individual level, particularly if your dream is the one that faltered. What I see in the local markets, people who've done it before. Where 3, 4, 5 years ago, you would have needed to import that experience. Now you don't.
And look, I think that's been a great thing. And then probably the most rewarding thing for me on this journey, particularly with the podcast, the amount of people now that I get on who are early stage founders who have listened to it for the last 2.5 years. Yeah. And it's like we've created this archive of what to do and what not to do, right? Yeah. And all these different ways of doing things. And, I remember back, I think episode 4 or 5 was Eric from Zinger. Sadly, they're no longer with us and one of the ones to go. But I think, the regulators were brave. The regulators knew that, at least one of these businesses was going to fail. And they still went ahead and did it. And at the time, I was a bit disappointed. But in hindsight, it was a really brave call that's led now to this innovation.
But it's exactly what you say. The regulator was brave. Sadly, not every business succeeds. Yeah. And there's always that exuberance and enthusiasm. And you do see a lot of
Well, out of the 4, though, we've had it at Upbank were bought by Bendigo, 86400, bought by NAB. Yep. Vault Bank is still around, it pivoted to banking as a service. So I think, one went down, the other 3 are still around. I think it's, and if, the 86400, I think, is again another world leading kind of example of the business that goes and creates something and builds the whole bank that then, and I'm pretty certain NAB were looking at a core banking solution and decided to buy Neobank instead. So it's a really good example of how, again, just doing things a bit differently.
But all of those show maturity of the ingredients. Mm. And I think that's what changed. It's the energy of, we found our sea legs. The fact that big players like Westpac are going, I'm going to lead, which you don't see in a lot of other jurisdictions as well. Yeah. Chase in very different ways doing the same in the UK, different business model, but they're going like, hold my beer. Mm. I think that's exciting and it creates an energy. Yeah. So with regulatory maturity, maturity of skill set in your talent pool and experiences, and some of the traditional players stepping into the ring and some of the challengers maturing, it changes the energy. And I think that's what's different in Australia.
We're facing some headwinds. I think everybody is. What do you see for the future of fintech?
I've been saying there will be an adjustment for a very long time, and particularly in the early days of fintech, when it was still a very sort of kumbaya setup where the corporates would host fintech martinis and everyone was friends. It was, and I was really worried at the time because there were so many people packing in their jobs and becoming founders. Yeah. And such a big chunk of those businesses was always going to fail. Not just because they hadn't thought it through and they didn't have the skill set needed to bring this thing to life, or they didn't appreciate how much funding it would need, but also because the market can only absorb so many of something. And there's always a little bit of a hype here and there. So I'm seeing fewer. I mean, I met about 15 years ago a founder who had created a singing bank. So essentially it was a widget that you added to your online banking and it played tunes for any credit and debit. Now, most of us are salaried. So the tune is very repetitive. You get a happy, you go pay tune once a month and everything else is boo, 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 boo. Yeah. It wasn't a thing that was useful. And yet they were there and they had built a business around it. Unusually niche and out there. Mm. But I do think that we're going into a period where...
They're now into Web3.
They're probably now into Web3. I think we're going to see funding constraints because of everything that's happening. We are going to see... I read one of your articles with great interest a couple of weeks ago because it's been a talent market for a very long time, immense scarcity. And all of a sudden, a lot of the big fintechs have been laying people off in really large numbers, and it was sudden. Yeah. And you probably anticipated. I will confess I didn't. But that will really change the dynamics in the market. So I think we'll see probably a bit of a bit more sobriety But I do think that the people who've been doing good work and have enough proof points will hopefully be okay. Yeah. Starting out now will be very hard.
Yeah. I think that, if you're starting absolutely blank slate day one today, it might be a little bit easier. But if you've been going 12, 18 months, or some businesses been going 4 years and they're still not generating revenue or got product market fit, I think they're the ones that are really going to struggle through this kind of 12, 18 months. I agree with that.
And I think there's an interesting reflection point for all of us. Depending on your business model, there is a point of no return by which you should have proven that you can generate revenue, because you are meant to be creating a business. I had this conversation not so long ago in the UK context about the challengers. Some of them have been going for almost a decade. At which point should you be in the black? We don't know the answer to a lot of these things, but you need to have a view for your own business, because there's been a time when VC funding was plentiful. And when you would get into profitability was an open-ended question. Now, anyone who's been in business long enough knows that being profitable isn't binary. Showing a path to profitability in a time frame that makes sense for your vertical and showing growth to dominate your market at possibly the expense of profitability, something that an investor will look at and go, I'll back this. So it's not just about being in the black, it's about knowing how you will get there. Yeah. The businesses that know how to do that and understand the market, I do hope and trust will be okay. But there have been a lot of businesses, some of them have marked early success, that don't know how to get there. And I think that will be a challenge.
Yeah. You talked about the talent piece, and I guess what we're seeing now is redundancies. What would be your advice to anybody out there who might be worried about their kind of safety or their job security, as to the skills that I'm not going to say are going to kind of future-proof you, but if you're in a position where you might unfortunately have to look at where do I make cuts, what are the skills and the people that you're going to make sure that you retain in the business?
Businesses don't always make cuts in logical places, as some of the challengers in the UK found out in a few years back when COVID started, and they made cuts and they were lambasted pretty publicly for the choices they made. There's always a logic internally, but how it plays out externally. So I would say that there are certain skill sets that will always be needed, but whether you will be within the number that is needed is always tricky. I would say that for me, when it comes down to if you're driven by sort of objective drivers and allowing for humanity in all of this, of course, because we're never as objective as we'd like, I'd say that the two things that will make you valuable in a company that has to make cuts is teachability. Are you the sort of person that can learn new things and adapt to new situations and circumstances? Right.
And that question that you ask about what was the last thing that you learned?
Are you teachable? I remember when I first started hiring engineers, I called the magnificent Michael Gardner, who's the head of the innovation labs in Silicon Valley for BNY Mellon. I was like, I don't know how to interview engineers. It was the first time I was hiring engineers. How do I even know what a good engineer is, other than they'll pass their technical interview with someone? Yeah. He said, always hire for teachability. What they know is less important than how they learn. Best advice I've ever been given, and not just for engineers. So teachability is the first one. The second is I always try to hire and definitely retain for attitude over aptitude, particularly for businesses going through hard times. What it feels like inside the ship and how people come to work and put their shoulder into it together is super important. The people who make you feel I'm doing this for you and not necessarily your boss, your trench buddy. And that attitude of camaraderie of, my teams stay up late working with each other because they saw the other person in the office, or they saw their Slack green light on, and they will work across departments and functions because well, if you're working late, I'll help you out and
Yeah.
you'll work less late. That if you are the person that people will go into battle with, you're teachable and you have that humility. These are not skills, they're behavioral patterns, but actually, because the reality is, will you always need platform engineers? Of course. Will you always need data scientists, designers? Of course, you will always need all of those things. How many of those, though?
Yeah.
If you had 100, now you have to cut down, we had to 50, 25. What differentiates you is how you behave in the workplace. 100% how you behave in the workplace. I always say it to my team, being a good colleague is the most important thing, always.
Yeah.
Both for right now and for the future, because your next job will most probably come from someone who's your peer now.
Yeah, absolutely. We get some seriously great talent listen to this podcast and watch the show. What's the best way for people to get in touch if they're interested in working with 10x?
Oh, please come and work with 10x. 10x is growing in Australia quite rapidly. We have a fantastic team on the ground, small, and they need friends.
Well, small, but it's what, 30 odd people?
Yeah, it's 34 people, but we need more.
That's big for an international here in Oz, right?
It is true. It is true. It's relative to others. It is big, but we're growing rapidly in Australia. We have big plans for Australia, so we are developing and growing this team. There are some roles already being advertised on our website, but I am easily reachable at Leda Glyptis on social media, leda.glyptis, 10xbanking.com. If you're interested, ping us a note and I'll connect you to the folks on the ground who can tell you exactly how the team is developing. It's an exciting time.
Cool. And what can we expect from 10x in this next 12 months?
We have been working with a couple of clients who can't quite announce yet. So I'm hoping in the next 12 months we'll be able to announce some interesting new names. This
is the show that gets all of the exclusives that we can't announce.
Well, I'll come back. When I can announce it, I'll come back. That's the deal. So we're happy with that. For us, working with both the banking as a service platform and the institutional bank at Westpac is incredibly significant, both because it allows us to really prove the scalability of the vision, and because it conveys the trust that our partner is putting in us. So
it's massive.
That
right? It's massive. Like
it's
when I was approached in what I think was September 2019, and I heard about everything that was happening, that was the proof point. Till then, I thought open banking, it's all just a lot of hot air. Yeah, and then when I heard that, I was NDA'd and I couldn't say anything. And I just wanted to tell everybody what was happening.
I know. I have felt like that for a long time. So in a way, I know we're in an industry that likes announcements, but one of the things that I'm looking forward to for the next 12 months is the work that we will be doing. Because announcements are great, starting things is great, but going live with them is greater, and seeing them flourish, seeing them grow. So we have some amazing work to do with some incredible partners. I'll tell you this about the people we're working with here in Australia. They're impressive. They're an impressive team of great talent, great people with great vision who are hungry and they want to do great things for the Australian market. And I love it. I absolutely love it. So the next 12 months we'll be building some incredible stuff with great partners.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Leda, it's been fantastic to chat with you. So good to see you again. Great to have you back in Oz. Great to hear about the 10x story. And thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Fintech Chatter TV. Presented by Tier 1 People. Leaders in Fintech Executive Search.